Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well and that everyone is safe in the midst of the hurricane. I only lost power for maybe like half a day, so I'm taking full advantage of having power back to record this video. Just before I dig into content, I wanted to say if there's any kind of technological issue that has come up during the storm that has stopped you from doing your work or that's made things harder, the biggest thing is that you just communicate with me and we can hopefully work something out. So know that I'm a human as well, and I also lost power, so we can work some things out. I wanted to touch base on your discussion board post before I talked about our assignment for this week. Like I said, this is one of my favorite case studies. I did not personally teach Adam. Of course, we've given him a pseudonym, but one of my colleagues did teach Adam. So this is based on a true story, which makes it even more fun. It also just gives it a lot more of that anecdotal evidence of the fact that you're quite likely to experience these types of situations, and you probably already have. Hopefully, that's why some of you are taking this course. So before I jump into your specific comments, which were excellent, I just wanted to give you some of the first characteristics that I would recognize if I was in this situation. The biggest and honestly the most broad observation that I would make is that Adam just seems different in a lot of different ways. So not just artistically, but also he's experiencing this classroom in a very different manner than his peers seem to be experiencing the classroom. So he's asking questions differently, he's completing his work differently, he's spending his time differently, he's misbehaving differently, and all of that, quote, different is kind of like a flag for me to dig deeper and to think, okay, what is really going on with this student? Could there be more than meets the eye? Maybe he's not this, quote, sarcastic student who's just trying to misbehave. Maybe there's something much deeper than that. And as many of you guys pointed out in this study, Adam is definitely showing some indicators of giftedness, and I would say would definitely require some additional services to meet his strengths and his needs. So a few major differences I see. First, he's on task for a lot longer than other students. It kind of sounds like he's even obsessively on task, like he won't stop finishing or won't stop working on the project, rather. If you think about that one student who won't stop reading and won't stop reading, and then it's time to go to PE, so you turn the lights out and he's still reading. He's obsessively on task. When we study creativity, we'll learn about this concept called flow. If you've heard of a researcher called Csikszentmihalyi, which I feel so proud of being able to pronounce his name now. But he has this concept of psychological flow, that when we are doing something creative, we literally get lost in the idea. So that would probably be a stretch in this case, because I don't know if he's engaged in an enormous amount of creative productivity at that moment. But that would definitely be an indicator for me that he is so much more on task than the other students. He's also different in terms of his communication. So the way that he is, some of you mentioned potentially being sarcastic with the teacher, that is a different form of communication. In fact, sarcasm requires a lot of intelligence and a lot of experience to understand how to craft sarcasm. A lot of times for gifted students, it comes out in their humor. Sometimes that humor is different than the typical like potty humor that you'll see with every child. They're making more sarcastic jokes, plays on words, and that is actually indicative of giftedness as well. I also think that he is clearly developmentally different. And several of you mentioned the fact that he is demonstrating fine motor skills, that he is drawing things to scale. I had one conversation with a student previously that centered on, well, is Adam gifted, or do we think he's just a high achiever and he's working really hard? And my argument for Adam being probably more gifted is the fact that a 4-year-old can work really hard and stay on task, but he's not going to produce this developmentally different product. He is producing something quite different than his peers. It's drawn to scale. It has shading techniques. He's got even different like anatomical parts of the turkey that you wouldn't expect this kind of child to know. So he does seem different than peers versus just on task for longer, which would be more indicative of that high ability student, or high achiever rather. Also, I think it's really interesting that he sees these connections between the shading on the Crayola box and trying to mimic that technique in his personal drawing. That's definitely an indicator of creativity, as a lot of work with creativity is about making connections between things that don't seem to fit together. Also, his assertion to ask Miss Connolly why, man, gifted students love that question because they are very logical thinkers at times. They want to know, well, why can't I just keep working on this project? Why? They want a very practical answer, and answers such as because I said so, or that's the rules, or it's time for PE, don't necessarily work with gifted students. So I think originally I see a lot of differences between Adam and most likely his peers. Thankfully, since this is my bread and butter of gifted education, I see those differences in a good way. But as several of you wrote, it's very tempting to interpret those differences as maybe something more negative. So I wanted to point out a couple of things that you wrote. I really liked Drew's assertion that Adam does not experience things like a normal child. So one of my favorite quotes, and forgive me because I can't remember the author right now, is that a gifted student is gifted 100% of the time. They are always gifted. It's not like they're only gifted in their pull-out class. They're literally networked differently. They experience things differently outside of the classroom, inside of the classroom. Now, they have particular strengths. They may be more gifted in certain subject areas than others, but it's not like they have a switch that turns the giftedness on and off. So they don't experience things in the same way that their regular aged peers would experience them. Lexi did a good job talking about how the fact that Adam is really bored could cause him to misbehave, which is a definite issue in gifted education if we do not provide the correct services. And I also liked Elizabeth's suggestion that his perfectionism may actually look like procrastination. So if you have that one student who's been working on that one paper and you just want to see the paper, but they won't let you see it, or they're, quote, forgetting it, they really could be just perfecting it. They could be unwilling to show you something that, according to their own standards, is not good enough. So sometimes it's easy to see a lack of completion of work as procrastination or not being dedicated, but on the flip side, that could also be indicative of perfectionism. I liked Allison's very practical suggestion to ask Adam, what did you mean by this question? What do you mean finished or good? Why did you ask that? So often we try to figure out what our students are thinking when we could just ask the student what they are thinking. So that would be a really good practical starting place, maybe even in that type of setting when we're having a parent-teacher conference. Maybe bring Adam and have a conversation with him that's not accusatory, but it's rather, let's engage in a conversation. He's craving that type of attention anyway. Let's get into your mind for a minute and see how you're really processing things. Cynthia said that we need to shift from seeing his behavior as a problem to one that expresses a specialized need. That's a beautiful quote that Eliza, she kind of had a similar assertion saying that we should view characteristics like working slowly as strengths. Both of those suggestions are really indicative of what we call a dynamic mindset instead of a deficit mindset. When we study Invisible Gifted, we'll talk about that a lot. So how can we enter the classroom and see, quote, problems as opportunities for growth? How can we see the student who's misbehaving, and rather than interpreting that bad behavior as something negative, how can we see the underlying positive potential gifted characteristic that is causing that bad behavior? So you guys did a really good job on this. I'm encouraged to see you talking to each other. Since this is not a face-to-face class, it's really important that you're keeping your eyes on that discussion board, that you're talking to each other, asking each other questions. I love that we have both experienced educators and people who are starting out. I always say I learn more from you guys, particularly because you're in very different and diverse environments. So keep up the good work. Make sure that within your discussion posts, you are quoting your sources, giving me the page numbers if you're giving a direct quote, and also bringing in multiple sources. So usually the best discussion posts bring in lots of different things. So you're talking about a video, but then you're talking about a personal experience, and you're talking from an article, you're talking from a PowerPoint slide. If we think about from a research standpoint, what you're really doing is you're triangulating the evidence. So you're giving evidence from multiple sources to make your point. So rather than just quoting one study or one video multiple times, I would encourage you to bring several different sources into your discussion posts. I did want to point out one more direct quote before we move on. And Kayla, she did a really good job actually setting the stage for me to introduce this next week. But she actually said that she would suggest Ms. Connolly conduct an evaluation of Adam's characteristics and use some kind of checklist to gather data. So when we are attempting to identify students for gifted services, regular education teachers are the gatekeepers for this. So it's a very big misconception that, oh, well, you're the gifted ed teacher, you'll take care of the gifted students. Well, the gifted ed teacher oftentimes doesn't get the gifted students until they are identified. So as the regular education teacher, you have to keep your eyes open, and you have to be appropriately trained to recognize who these gifted students may be. I really like this suggestion for having a teacher checklist. When we have a checklist, it is really important for reliability and validity of interpreting whether or not a student may or may not be fit for gifted services. If we think about reliability, consider the fact that we want to consistently get the same information. If I was to give just one test and one measure, that would just be measuring the student's capability one time. However, if I fill out a teacher observation checklist throughout the entire semester, I have multiple different data points. So I can look at clusters of data, and that's much more reliable. Also, when we think about validity, whether or not we're actually measuring what we say we are measuring, a teacher observation checklist is, if based on research, a really good tool because you can see all of the different characteristics of giftedness in the way that it can manifest in diverse manners. So we're not just looking at above average academics or above average aptitude. With a checklist, we're also looking at the behaviors that could be indicative of giftedness as well. So if used appropriately, I am a really big fan of teacher checklists. Some states will use teacher checklists as one of the indicators of gifted, in addition to aptitude or achievement scores. At times they could be misused, and we'll actually talk about that, or you may notice that in your next assignment. But it does require a significant amount of training to be able to use a checklist well. And there's a lot of research that goes into how to write a checklist that would produce reliable and valid results. So overall, great job on that discussion post. I've received a lot of emails from you all, just discussion post responses about how you're recognizing some of these myths and realities in your actual day-to-day practice, and that's really encouraging to me. So keep up the good work on that. So as we look into our next week, we'll finish up this module on the characteristics of gifted students. And by doing that, you have an application assignment. So your task is to think of one student that you are either currently teaching, you have taught in the past, is your next door neighbor, is your son or daughter, is a friend, any student that you have interacted with before and that you feel probably is gifted, but you're not quite sure. So choose a student. Again, there's not any really strict criteria on who you choose. Just choose someone that you know well. And in that folder on module assignments, you'll see the information for this gifted child checklist. So there's two things you do. First, open up the checklist. This is the actual checklist that a teacher would fill out, and it lists some different behaviors that would be indicative of gifted students, and then has the teacher fill them out. I've seen some students just put teachers put check marks. I would encourage you, as you fill out this checklist, pretend like it's the real thing. So give me some evidence. Make sure that you are in the columns actually maybe jotting down a couple of specific examples, elaborating on why you checked certain things. And then based off of that checklist, you write a 1 to 2 page narrative that is defending whether or not you think this student would be fit for gifted services. So again, you're going to upload the checklist as well as this narrative in one submission. A couple of notes. First of all, on grading, there's a very general rubric that's attached to this assignment. The three main things that I'm looking for, the first is expert knowledge. So when you are defending your case, you need to be able to say, I know that his attention to detail is potentially indicative of gifted behavior because of X. So you need to back up what you're saying. It needs to be clear based off of this paper or submission, not a paper, that you have not just read the material, but you're also synthesizing it and understanding it. So make sure that you're reflecting that knowledge. If you do quote any sources, which I would encourage you to do, please make sure that you do so in APA style. So that's your first criteria. The next is that you're giving not only an accurate response, but also a comprehensive and thorough response. So if you've got 1 to 2 pages, don't just use 3/4 of a page. So again, with giving multiple sources, not just focusing in on one resource, but rather giving a lot of reasons why or why not you think this student is gifted. And then finally, making sure that you're articulating your work and your thoughts well, that you're rereading things and there aren't typos. Sorry about this. So I think it would be important for you to just look back at that rubric, but I wanted to clarify those 3 things I'm looking for. On the checklist itself, I just want you to fill it out as detailed as possible. I'm not going to deduct points if you can't think of like specific details within the checklist, but make sure in that defense you're really defending whether or not you think that student needs to be recommended for gifted services. One last note, and I always go back and forth on whether or not I want to tell the students this, but this is actually not my favorite checklist. I'm actually not a big fan of this one, and I'm not going to tell you why yet. We'll get into that later in the semester, but as you are filling out this checklist, I want you to look at it with a critical eye. Are there things that you think need to be improved? Do you think that this checklist is giving everyone a fair chance of being identified for gifted services? Just be wary of things like this. So oftentimes when we're educators and teachers, there's just so much information and someone gives us this checklist and it's like, fill this out. But you really need to look at it with a critical eye and think, do I like this checklist in the first place? And you are beginning to be trained in gifted education. So I want you to think, do I like this checklist in the first place? And we'll touch back on that and kind of dig deeper into that later this semester. So again, that's your only assignment for the week. Make sure that you are posting both your checklist and your narrative. And make sure you look into that rubric and you are defending your answer and being as thorough and accurate as possible. Again, I hope that everyone is safe and with power, and my cat's been sleeping over there the whole time. I thought she would make an appearance, but apparently she wanted to leave us alone. So y'all have a wonderful week, and as always, contact me if you have any questions. Thanks.